Hey Mini enthusiasts, how you doing? Welcome back. I hope you're all having a great day. And you join us back on Project ERA, and I think this is part 4. So there's quite a bit to narrate my way through this week. Some of it may be a little bit boring. So I'll try and add some sort of insight and some useful information as we go through. And maybe a little bit about the ERA itself. So you can see here Mark is stripping the subframes down. This is while the body was off being shot blasted actually, so this is footage from a few weeks ago now. We're obviously a little bit advanced to that now. I could probably tell you a few little bits about the front subframe that's maybe different on an ERA. So it has 4-pot ventilated brake discs on the back. They are AP Lockheed, and they were basically direct from the MG Metro parts bin. The brakes are also bigger than they are on a standard Mini, so they're 213mm, and of course at the time in the 90s brakes were already servo assisted, so they're servo assisted brakes. The front hubs themselves are standard Mini hubs, although they do have a spacer bracket fitted on the steering arm, which raises the steering arm up off the hub by about, I think it's possibly about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch, and that's to do with the steering geometry, with the 13-inch wheels being lowered. It just gets the steering geometry right, and I believe it's there to reduce the amount of bump steer that you get associated with lowering a car, bigger wheels, and I think also it's to do with the negative camber bottom arms. So the lower suspension arms on an ERA are fixed 1.5 degree negative camber, which improves the handling of the car, but it also helps to prevent the torque steer you kind of got associated with those sort of 1980s, 1990s front wheel drive hot hatch type cars. I can fondly remember things like XR3Is and Ford Escort RS turbos that used to torque steer all over the place. Actually made for quite a exciting drive, but not the best handling. But an ERA is actually pretty good for that. Even when you up the power a little bit, as I say, I've had a couple in the past. I had a black one with an Avon bar engine, and I think that was running around about 120 brake horsepower, and that had very little torque steer. It was still quite pleasant to drive. So front subframe is now stripped, and that will go off to be powder coated prior to fitting it back in the car. And all the components on the front of all the components on the front and rear subframes will most likely be replaced with new. Where Mark can get new components, I think there's possibly only a few little bits he might struggle to get, but he's replacing everything with either new or new old stock. That might seem a little bit mad, but when you apply the rationale that the car had done over 260,000 miles, there's some components on it that, even though they might still be serviceable, the question comes in of how fatigued they are really. So things like the hubs, certainly the bottom arms, they were quite dented up, and you could see where there was wear in the taper for the swivels, just because they've probably been off in their lifetime multiple times, multiple ball joint splitters on them, and they've just become a little bit damaged over the years. They were serviceable, but at this point in the car's life, there's lots of fatigue parts in there that really just, they just deserve to be replaced. They've served their time well. The rear subframe on an ERA, again, is pretty standard. The rear bump stops are modified on an ERA actually. Not the bump stops, they've got a bump stop that is fitted inside the rear rubber cone. I do believe they fitted it on earlier Minis, But where you have 13-inch wheels, they can reach the full length of the suspension travel, and if you don't have a bump stop built in, they make a horrible crashing noise from the rear subframe. So inside the actual rubber donut itself, there is a small bump stop that's held on with a nut through the back of the hole where you would insert like the spring compressor tool. And I can't remember what else on the rear subframe. Obviously the fuel pump's located on the rear subframe. Front subframe also has an extra bracket fitted on it for the front towing hook or towing attachment, because the body kit's obviously in the way of where the normal one would go on the tie rods. And it has extra holes for an extra engine steady, which is at the bottom of the gearbox on the near side front rear, and that's just to improve the fixing or mounting of the engine, just because obviously you're handling that extra power. So as we go through, I'll try and add a bit more detail as we go on, and I've just skimmed over the subframes there a bit. Mark's just back to the car now, so I think I might have explained in the previous episode, the front bulkhead is a new heritage part, but they don't seem to do exactly the right bulkhead for an ERA, and that's pretty obvious really. They're not going to produce a bulkhead for something where there's only sort of 99 UK cars on the road. So there's a few modifications for the bulkhead, notably the turbo box. The fuel pipe, feed pipe and return pipe actually runs through the front bulkhead crossmember as well. So Mark's got a bulkhead. I think Heritage probably do one pressing for the bulkhead and then they adapt it depending on what mark of mini you got. What that actually means is there are some subtle differences, one of those being the toe board. So the toe board is a slightly different shape on the new bulkhead to what it is on the car itself. So although you can see Mark here, he's cleaning up that toe board, getting it ready to accept the new bulkhead. When he started looking close, it looked different, and further on in this actually Mark could see some additional corrosion down in the toe board, so the decision was made to take the toe board out as well. So these things happen, and I'm sure we'll have many more little issues like this as we go through. And obviously at the moment Mark is just cleaning off all the paint, anywhere where there's been seam sealer or anything like that, because you need to clean it off and try and locate where the spot welds are. So this sort of work is really boring, it's tedious, it's messy, really don't enjoy doing it. It's probably the nicest bit is when you've cleaned up all the panels, you've got them all prepped up, and all you've got to do is either spot weld, seam weld or tack weld them back in place. That's kind of the nice bit to do, but all this cleaning up is just horrible, and it seems to go on and on and on forever. So as you can see, Mark's in there at the moment just cleaning off the seam sealer at the bottom of the toe board there. So a few other little facts as we go through. So the ERA had a claimed 0 to 60 time of 7.8 seconds. That's pretty quick that. And a standing quarter mile time of 16.6 seconds, which I think is actually pretty accurate at standing quarter time, because I've done a standing quarter mile in my ERA at Santapod and managed 16.67 seconds, I think it was, so almost standard, although it had been lightly modified. Mark's just showing us there It's cleaned off all the seam sealer and it's actually a bit of a nightmare now. So I don't know whether you can see, but that front floor pan to the hillboard has been plug welded on. So it's not spot welded, it's been plug welded. You can see a weld line down between the floor pan and the kind of exhaust transmission tunnel there. So that means it's had front floor pans replaced before, just the front parts, and they've plug welded it on. So that just makes it a little bit more difficult to drill the plug welds out or get them out. That the centre part of the floor, like the exhaust tunnel, transmission tunnel, is standard, and that's got loads of sort of deep spot welds there that need to be unpicked and taken out as well. So obviously no one's fault here, but yeah, like I say, just getting those plug welds out is a lot more difficult than spot welds. The spot weld drill, it's pretty easy. I was just talking about 0 to 60 times and standing quarter miles as well. I missed out the maximum speed of an ERA, 115 miles an hour. That's scary stuff in a Mini. And again, I've got well, it wasn't GPS, but I come back from the IMM in 2009, I think it was. It was in Germany, in Neumarkt to Oberpfalz. So along the German autobahn, and I saw it was about 118 miles an hour on the speedo, but it was an ERA speedo, to be fair, and they can be wildly inaccurate. So Mark's approach there to getting the toe board out was just to section it off. Sometimes some of the big panels like that, it is easier just to cut them down into smaller parts rather than trying to take the whole lot out in one go. It does make it a little bit of a pain, because if you want to use that panel to recheck measurements or anything like that, once you've cut it up into a jigsaw, you've lost those measurements, or you've lost something to compare it with. I have in the past actually welded panels back together purely just to take some measurements on them, or to line them back up with a car. But when you've got a big panel like that, sometimes there's no point fighting it. Just cut it down in smaller parts and deal with each part individually. It can get quite frustrating, and what you end up doing is getting frustrated and ripping the metal to pieces. So that's the toe board off now and all cleaned up. Look at these inner arches, how much rust there is there. Now again, no one can see that. That's between the layers of metal. But a few people, have asked maybe, or thought maybe going a little bit over the top with the restoration. The shell was in pretty good condition, but what you can't account for, what you can't see, is that rust between the joints. And again, this car is 30 years old. It's been restored more than once. It's got lots of new panels on it, and it's as expected, really. So yeah, that means the inner wings will be being replaced as well. But I think, like I mentioned last week, it becomes like a bit of a jigsaw now, and you haven't got the picture to do the jigsaw back together again. So as you take each bit out, you need to put another bit back in to keep the strength and to keep everything aligned. So again, just back onto the boring stuff now, cleaning up. The wheel Mark's using there is what's it called? It's called a strip and clean disc. They're very good actually. 100mm with a 6mm shank. Just put them on a drill. Really, really good at cleaning paint off. Thoroughly recommend them. They don't grind into the metal too much, hardly at all in fact, and they really make light work of getting paint off. So you might spot Project Bolt in the background there, the Racing Mini. and as you can see, it's got no engine in it at the moment, so there's some exciting stuff to come from that as well. So the engine has been away at Swifttune, being upgraded again. So it was 125 brake horsepower. It is now going to be 140, and it's still an A series. It's still naturally aspirated. And what other upgrades is it having? The gearbox is being upgraded, really just to cope with the power. So it already had straight cut gears, it's now getting straight cut gears with a dog box as well, and straight cut drop gears. So it should really whine now. But all of that just strengthens the gearbox. It means you lose less through transmission losses, so more of the power made at the engine ends up at the wheels. Mark's just applying cure rust there. That's a favourite of mine, works really well. I can't remember off the top of my head what chemical it is. You can make cure rust yourself though, and you can probably do it a little bit cheaper, but I think cure rust not too expensive, works pretty well. It adds a protective layer after you've put it on. And then Mark's just back to the boring job now. Obviously before anything is welded back on, whether it's spot welded, plug welded or seam welded, you need to make sure the metal, two surfaces being welded together, are perfectly clean. The cleaner the better. Any contamination between the welds causes horrible welds. It causes the welds to become porous. It's kind of rule number one of welding: weld clean metal only. You can't weld good metal to rust, and you can't weld metal to paint. So it all needs to come off. Probably the worst stuff ever is seam sealer. That really does seem to upset the welds. And again, it's a really boring job, but the surfaces need to be clean. And then what you do to stop them going rusty, you put this stuff called weld through primer on, which is either zinc or copper based. It needs to be a conductive paint, so it protects it from rust. And also once you're welded it together, you've got that protection there, so it's not just bare metal in between. So just use a bit of weld through primer, say works a treat. I'm just trying to think what's coming up in the next episode. Actually, I think it'll be the inner wings, and putting that bulkhead back in. Once the bulkhead's back in, inner wings are on, dash railing, yeah, it's on to the jig. So hope you enjoyed watching this week, and catch up with you again soon. Thanks for watching.